Welcome to today's study. We're diving into the Bible, exploring the key insights and teachings from Robert Breaker Ministries. And usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision, right?
Yeah, like engineering.
Right? It's like engineering. You break your arm, they take an X-ray, and it shows that jagged white line right on the screen. And the doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is. That is the problem.
Yeah, it's binary. I mean, it's objective. It's either broken or it's not.
Exactly. Broken or not broken. It's clean, and honestly, it's kind of comforting. We like things to be visible, to be categorized, to be easily sorted into these little folders in our minds. But then you step into the world of theology.
Right? Which is a whole different ballgame.
It really is. You step into the landscape of the human soul, and suddenly that X-ray machine,
Feels like it's completely broken. Yeah. We're looking at a spiritual landscape that is...
well, it can feel incredibly murky, very subjective.
Oh, absolutely. Because you have thousands of different interpretations of these ancient texts. Centuries of debate. Really?
Yeah. And it can leave you feeling like you're just grasping at smoke sometimes.
But the mission of our video podcast today is to look at a structural framework that attempts to bring that exact medical precision to the murkiness of theology.
And that's what makes this so interesting.
Right? We are going to explore a really fascinating numbering system in the Bible surrounding a highly specific concept called imputation.
Yeah. And the structural aspect of this is really where the intrigue begins. I mean, Mr. Breaker noticed in his study that the biblical text frequently uses the number 7 as like an organizing principle.
Which is pretty common, right? We see this everywhere in the scripture.
We do. There are the 7 churches addressed in Revelation, 7 seals, 7 days in a week, establishing the calendar. And broadly speaking, roughly 7,000 years of recorded biblical history if you follow certain timelines.
Right?
What's fascinating here is how the number 7 in biblical numerology often represents completion or, a closed loop of perfection.
Yeah. So it's not just some random digit drawn from a hat.
Exactly. So according to Mr. Breaker's research, finding exactly 7 distinct types of this specific mechanism, this thing called imputation, it isn't just a neat coincidence for a Bible student.
It's intentional.
Right? It suggests a complete overarching, highly engineered framework for how God theoretically deals with human beings. It traces a narrative arc from the very beginning of human history right down to you, the listener sitting here today.
And, our goal for you today is to really give you a full belly of this material. And I use that phrase very intentionally because Mr. Breaker used this really striking analogy that I want to unpack right out of the gate.
Oh, the calf analogy. Yeah, that's a good one.
It really is. He talked about a farmer who was explaining the highly precarious nature of a newborn calf. Like when a baby calf is born, it is incredibly vulnerable to the elements and to disease.
Yeah, they're super fragile.
Very fragile.
If it doesn't get to its mother immediately and nurse until its belly is absolutely completely full, its chances of survival just plummets. It needs that initial overwhelming dose of colostrum.
Which is so crucial biologically.
Exactly. That's the heavy, nutrient-dense first milk, packed with the vitamins and the minerals and all those crucial antibodies.
And the biology of that is actually a really profound metaphor because, if the cap just takes a little sip, like if it just wets its tongue and then gets distracted and walks away, it never experiences what it physically feels like to be completely satiated.
Its stomach literally doesn't expand.
Right? It won't crave that fullness later because it doesn't even know it exists. And structurally, it won't have the immune system to fight off the pathogens in the barnyard. I mean, it can literally wither away and die in a matter of days just from a lack of foundational nutrients.
And that is exactly what this study is designed to counteract in a spiritual sense. We want to give you that full belly. We want to look at, the sincere milk of the word.
Because a lot of people just sip it.
Yeah. A lot of times, people consume theology like that distracted calf. They get a tiny snippet, maybe, I don't know, a quick motivational quote on social media, a little sip of spirituality, and they just walk away.
And that's not enough to sustain you.
No, it's not. If you want to survive the intellectual and spiritual pathogens out there, you have to take in the deep, substantial nutrients of the text. You have to understand the foundational mechanics of the world. For you.
Well, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Mr. Breaker paired that biological analogy with a very modern mechanical one that I think drives the point home even further.
Oh, with a truck story.
Yes. Yeah.
He mentioned being on a road trip and his pickup truck kept running dangerously low on oil.
He was totally confused until he found out that his specific engine didn't just take, any off-the-shelf oil. It required a very exact, highly engineered type of oil called Dexos.
Which is a synthetic blend, right? Like it's formulated for very specific thermal tolerances.
Precisely. And when the mechanics had put in just standard conventional oil, the engine's heat and pressure were just burning it up. I mean, it was breaking down the viscosity and spitting it right out the tailpipe as exhaust.
That's rough on a vehicle.
Oh, it's terrible. Using the wrong substance wasn't just inefficient. It was actively destroying the internal mechanism of the engine. But once he drained it and put the exact right Dexos oil in, the engine ran perfectly, maintained its pressure, and stayed full.
So, how does Mr. Breaker apply that to the theology? Like, what's the connection?
Well, he compares this exactness to the concept of the Holy Spirit in biblical theology. The argument is that the human soul is engineered for a specific substance. If you have the right oil, the true spirit as defined by the text, it sustains the mechanism of your life.
But if you use the wrong stuff,
Right? If you fill your engine with the wrong spirit, say, a counterfeit philosophy, a toxic worldview, or what the text would actually call a demonic influence. It might look like oil on the dipstick temporarily, but under the pressure of life, it's going to break down.
it just can't handle the heat.
Exactly. It will burn you out, create toxic exhaust in your life, and ultimately destroy the engine.
I really love the friction in that analogy. It forces us to ask, what exactly are we putting into our engines? But if we are going to fill up on the right substance today, if we're going to examine this 7-part framework, we really need to define our terms clearly.
Yeah. Definitions are key here.
Right? We need to define the core concept of imputation. So for the listener who is hearing this word for the first time, or maybe has only heard it in passing, what does this actually mean? How does Mr. Breaker define it?
Well, imputation is at its root an accounting or a legal term. It's not some mystical, ethereal concept. It is cold, hard mathematics applied to the law.
Okay? Mathematics.
Yeah. If you imagine a physical ledger book like a column for credits and a column for debt, ation means to attribute to credit or to charge a specific value to someone's account. It is essentially a transfer.
Like a bank transfer.
Exactly. If I impute $100 to your bank account, I have credited you with money you did not personally earn. Your balance goes up based entirely on an external action.
But it works the other way too, right?
It does. If I impute a massive debt to your account, you are now legally responsible for paying it, even if you weren't the one who initially racked up the charges. Is the ledger simply states what you owe?
That sounds terrifying.
It can be to ground this biblically. Mr. V, blessed is the man unto whom the Lord imputeth not iniquity.
So iniquity basically being sin or wrongdoing.
Yes. And if we look at that through an accounting lens, that verse is the ultimate financial statement for the soul. Blessed or deeply happy and secure is the person whose spiritual bank account is not charged with the overwhelming debt of their own moral failure.
So the debt is there, but they aren't charged for it.
Right? The debt exists, the crimes were committed, but the judge looks at the ledger and says, I'm not imputing this to your account.
Okay, let's unpack this, because understanding that ledger is the only way the rest of this framework makes any sense. And that brings us to the very first of the 7 imputations, which honestly really sets the grim foundation for the entire human condition according to this theology.
It really does. It's the baseline.
Yeah. The first imputation Mr. Breaker identifies is Adam's sin imputed to mankind.
This is the starting line, and it's a controversial one.
Extremely controversial. I mean, Mr. Breaker takes us to Romans 5:12 and 1 Corinthians 15:2-22 to explore this. The core argument here is that Adam's choice of the Garden of Eden wasn't just a localized personal mistake.
No, it wasn't just his own problem.
Right? It wasn't just a guy eating a piece of fruit and getting a slap on the wrist. The text argues that this single act of rebellion fundamentally altered human DNA. It imputed a fallen, sinful nature to all of mankind. The verse says that by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men.
This is a crucial foundational concept for the entire biblical narrative. It establishes a massive paradigm shift in how we view human nature. It argues that we aren't just sinners because we occasionally commit sins.
Which is how most people think about it.
Exactly. But this framework says rather we commit sins because we are born with a nature that is fundamentally genetically geared toward rebellion. We are born broken. The spiritual debt of Adam's treason was charged. It was imputed to the genetic ledger of the entire human race. It's an inherited bankruptcy.
I want to push back on this a little bit, though, because if I'm a skeptic listening to this, my immediate thought is, how is that fair?
It's the classic objection.
Yeah. How does this framework justify me, thousands of years later, being held liable for a choice made by an ancestor in a garden I've never even seen? It feels like being born with $1 million credit card bill in my name that someone else spent.
It's a very natural objection, and it's one theologians have wrestled with for millennia. But Mr. Breaker's framework, drawing on the Pauline epistles, suggests that Adam wasn't just an individual. He was the federal head, the literal seed source of humanity.
So like the very start of the bloodline.
Right? If you pollute the absolute headwaters of a river, every single drop of water downstream is going to carry that pollution. It's less about God arbitrarily deciding to punish you for Adam's choice, and more about the biological and spiritual reality of reproduction. A corrupted system can only reproduce corrupted offspring.
That makes a harsh kind of sense.
Yeah. You inherit the physical vulnerability to disease, and you inherit the spiritual vulnerability to sin.
Which brings up a really fascinating hypothetical that Mr. Breaker raised in his study. And honestly, I haven't been able to stop thinking about, I read it. We know there were multiple trees in the garden. Right.
Right. It wasn't just the one.
Exactly. There was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which Adam and Eve ate from, triggering this whole fall. But there was also the tree of life. And Mr. Breaker asks this speculative question. What if Adam, immediately after eating the forbidden fruit, realized the catastrophic mistake he just made, panicked, ran across the garden, and took a massive bite out of the tree of life?
That raises a profound philosophical question, and the answer reveals a tremendous amount about how this theology views the nature of divine mercy, because the text implies that the tree of life literally sustained eternal physical life.
Okay.
If Adam had eaten from it after falling into sin, the physiological result would be that he would live forever.
Which sounds great on the surface. I mean, immortality is the ultimate human pursuit, right? Silicon Valley is spending billions of dollars trying to achieve exactly that.
They are. But you have to consider the state of that immortality. He would have lived forever in a fallen, sinful, inherently deteriorating state.
Yeah, imagine the horror of that. Imagine living for 6, 7, 10,000 years. Your body is failing, your cells are corrupted, your mind is continually degrading under the weight of a sinful nature. The society around you is compounding in its evil generation after generation.
A nightmare you can't wake up from.
Exactly. And you are entirely biologically unable to die. You are trapped in a decaying vessel forever.
Wow. That paints physical death in a completely different light. It reframes death as like a boundary.
Exactly. Within this framework, physical death is actually a strange, severe kind of mercy by God, stepping in, literally placing cherubim with flaming swords to guard the tree of life so Adam couldn't access it. God was ensuring that humanity would not be locked into an eternal state of fallen deterioration.
So death actually stopped the bleeding in a way.
Yes, death provides a hard limit to earthly suffering. Yes, it is a consequence. Romans makes it clear that the wages of sin is death. But it also creates the necessary conditions for an exit strategy.
An exit strategy.
Yeah, if we couldn't die, we couldn't be resurrected. We couldn't be saved from this fallen world and given a new, uncorrupted nature. Death becomes the necessary doorway to redemption.
That is incredibly profound. It takes something we instinctively view as the ultimate tragedy and recontextualizes it as a required mechanism for rescue.
It shifts the whole paradigm.
It really does. But that naturally transitions us to the second type of imputation because we have the inherited nature from Adam. We have the polluted headwaters. But when are we as individuals actually held personally responsible for the water we drink?
Right. Because inheriting a condition is fundamentally different from actively committing a crime.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second imputation. Personal sin imputed to the individual. We are all born with Adam's fallen nature, which means we are all inevitably going to face physical death. But at what point on the timeline of a human life? Does God actually charge our specific personal sins to our individual ledger?
This deals directly with the concept of individual accountability and the mechanics of divine justice. It answers the question, is God just arbitrarily punishing the ignorant?
And to illustrate this tension, Mr. Breaker shared a deeply moving, honestly heartbreaking story from his time in Honduras. He knew a family down there who went through an unimaginable tragedy.
Yeah, the story about the baby.
Yeah. The mother was pregnant, and at 8 months. Once the baby passed away in the womb, they had named the baby Esperanza, which translates to hope. Now, the heavy, agonizing theological question that a grieving family faces in that exact moment is, what happens to Esperanza?
It's a question every parent in that situation asks.
Right? If she inherited Adam's polluted, sinful nature, does that mean she goes to hell? And Mr. Breaker says absolutely, definitively not. He argues she is in heaven.
And the theological framework he uses to support that isn't just sentimental. It's rooted in a deep reading of Romans 2:1-15. It revolves around what theologians commonly refer to as the age of accountability.
Which is such a crucial concept here.
What's fascinating here is how the framework portrays God's justice as being perfectly, meticulously calibrated to human psychology. According to this teaching, God does not impute personal sin. He does not write a debt in the ledger until an individual reaches an age or mental capacity where their God-given cont fully activates.
And they have to make a choice.
Exactly. They have to knowingly, willfully choose wrong over right.
So if we look at Esperanza, or an infant, or perhaps someone with a severe cognitive disability who simply cannot grasp abstract moral choices, they haven't crossed that specific threshold.
Exactly. They possess Adam's fallen nature, which is why physical death still occurs even in the womb. Death is the biological result of the inherited condition. But they have not committed personal transgressions against their own conscience.
They haven't broken the internal law yet.
Right? Romans 2 talks about the law being written in our hearts, our conscience bearing witness, and our thoughts either accusing or excusing us. For personal sin to be imputed, there must be a conscious violation of that internal law.
And Mr. Brea points out that this age isn't a fixed number, like, turning 18. It varies wildly depending on a child's environment, their maturity level, the culture they grow up in.
It's subjective to the individual's development.
Yeah. But there is a definitive moment, a psychological crossing of the Rubicon where a child does something they inherently deeply know is wrong, and they feel the distinct weight of guilt from their conscience, and
that is the precise moment the accounting ledger activates. That is when personal sin is imputed to them. They transition from being merely a victim of Adam's nature to being an active, accountable participant in rebellion. They become individually responsible before the judge.
which, if you accept the premise, means God's account system is entirely fair. You aren't condemned to eternal judgment for something you had no mental capacity to comprehend. The debt is only assigned when you knowingly sign the receipt.
Precisely. It balances the reality of a fallen world with the necessity of individual justice. But that brings us to the third type of imputation, which is fascinating, because it forces us to step out of the divine heavenly courtroom for a moment and look at how this mechanism operates in our physical human societies.
Right? The third type is sin imputed by a king or the law. We are looking at the earthly shadows of this heavenly reality. Mr. Breaker points to Old Testament narratives, specifically verses like 1 Samuel 22:15 and 2 Samuel 19:19.
Yeah, where the word is explicitly used.
Right. In these texts, you have individuals literally throwing themselves on the ground, pleading with a human king not to impute guilt or iniquity to them.
To understand why this is a separate category of imputation, we really have to look at the historical and political context of the ancient world. In modern democracies, power is decentralized. You know, we have checks and balances. But in ancient times, a true monarch was the absolute unquestioned law of the land. He wasn't just an executive enforcing rules made by someone else. The king functioned as the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, all rolled into a single human being.
He's the entire government.
Yeah. He authored the law, he dispatched the soldiers to enforce it, and he sat on the throne to judge the violators.
Which Mr. Breaker notes is actually a design meant to point to God. He referenced Isaiah 33:22, which explicitly points to the Lord as our judge, our lawgiver, and our king. In the biblical framework, God holds all three of those titles simultaneously, perfectly, and righteously.
Yes, God is the ultimate autocrat, but a benevolent and perfect one. The problem arises because human kings are deeply, inherently flawed.
Right? Because of that first imputation.
Exactly. They have Adam's nature and their own imputed personal sins, yet they wield this massive power. So when an earthly king or even a modern court of law imputes guilt to a person, when a judge strikes the wooden gavel and says, "I find you guilty," this crime is legally charged to your account. It is a flawed, highly fallible, earthly reflection of this ultimate biblical concept of imputation.
And the terrifying part of that is that earthly laws can be completely unimaginably wicked. The ledger of human justice is often corrupt.
Very often.
Yeah. Mr. Breaker brought up a really visceral, dark historical example to illustrate the danger of an unrighteous king. He talked about the historical abuses perpetrated by English kings against the Scottish people, specifically referencing the concept of prima nocta.
Also known as the denor, or the right of the Lord.
Exactly. This was a supposed legal decree that essentially gave an English noble or lord the legal right to sleep with a Scottie fried on her wedding night before her actual husband was allowed to.
It is the ultimate example of state-sanctioned evil. An earthly king used his absolute authority to pass a law that legalized and formalized a horrific atrocity. The law imputed a right to the noble and demanded submission from the peasants. And Mr. Breaker used this historical nightmare to make a vital point about the Christian worldview regarding human authority. Because human laws can be so fundamentally broken, believers are sometimes required to be conscientious objectors.
Which is a heavy responsibility.
It is. If a king, a parliament, or a modern government enacts a law that directly violates the highest law, God's moral law, the framework suggests you have a moral obligation to refuse compliance.
Even if that refusal carries a heavy earthly cost.
Right? If you refuse, the earthly court will impute a crime to you. They will charge your earthly ledger with treason or civil disobedience, and they will send you to jail or worse. Your earthly ledger will clearly say guilty, but your heavenly ledger, the one overseen by the ultimate judge, demands obedience to God over man.
This tension raises a crucial point about the limits and the inadequacy of human justice. We all live under human laws, and generally societies try to abide by them to maintain order. But earthly justice is just a shadow. It's fragmented,
It's not the ultimate standard.
right? And to connect this to the bigger picture of how God views the law, Mr. Breaker brings up a terrifying standard found in James 2:8-10. This passage absolutely destroys the idea that we can be mostly good. It states that if you keep the entire law, but you offend one single point, you are guilty of all.
I really need to pause on that because that sounds completely illogical to our modern ears. Break one law, you break them all. If I get a parking ticket, I'm not a murderer. How does that make sense?
It doesn't make sense if you view laws as a disconnected checklist of rules, but the biblical framework views the law of God as a unified, singular reflection of his perfect, indivisible character. Think of it like a massive, pristine pane of glass. If you pick up a rock and throw it through the top left corner of that window, you don't just pick the corner. You haven't just committed a localized infraction. The structural integrity of the entire pane of glass is shattered. Cracks run through the whole thing. The glass is broken.
That is a brilliant analogy.
So, while an earthly court might impute guilt to you for a single speeding ticket, charge you $100, and ignore the rest of your generally law-abiding life, God's perfect justice operates differently. Because he is perfect, his standard is total perfection.
Which means we're all in trouble. Exactly. This illustrates exactly why, according to this theology, human beings cannot ever rely on their own ability to keep the rules to balance their spiritual ledger. It's mathematically impossible. The moment you commit your first personal sin, your pane of glass is already shattered. Your ledger is infinitely in the red.
Which is incredibly daunting. If the standard is absolute perfection, and my ledger is already ruined by Adam's inherited nature and compounded by my own personal choices, and my earthly justice system is corrupt, how do I possibly fix it? How does anyone survive this system?
Well, the short answer is you don't fix it yourself,
You can't.
right? The system requires an external intervention. And this leads us perfectly into the next phase of the historical timeline. We move into the Old Testament shadows. This is where God introduces a highly structured, temporary system to handle this impossible debt until the permanent solution arrives.
This covers Imputations 4 and 5. And this is where the text gets incredibly visceral. Imputation number 4 is righteousness imputed via Old Testament animal sacrifice.
This is where we see the profound concept of substitution formally introduced into human history.
Exactly. If you lived under the Old Testament law and you shattered your pane of glass, if you sinned, you couldn't just sit in your living room, look up at the ceiling, and say, "Hey God, my bad, I'm really sorry. I'll do better tomorrow."
An apology wasn't enough currency.
No, you couldn't just offer an apology. A broken divine law required a physical costly payment. According to Leviticus 17 and Leviticus 4, an innocent life had to be given. Blood had to be violently shed.
We really have to try to imagine the sensory reality of this because it's so alien to us. In our modern context, religion is often very sanitized. It's clean, it's quiet, it's highly cerebral. Sit in a padded pew, listen to a lecture, maybe sing a song.
Very safe.
Very safe. But the Old Testament tabernacle was a place of intense sensory overload. It was chaotic. It was loud with the sounds of animals. It smelled constantly of roasting meat, burning wood, and raw blood.
It was an abattoir. It was a slaughterhouse.
It was. If you sinned, the process was incredibly demanding. You had to go into your own flock. You had to select an innocent, unblemished animal, something of real value that you had raised. You had to put a rope around its neck and physically walk it through the camp, publicly acknowledging your guilt all the way to the bronze altar at the tabernacle.
Everyone would see you walking with it.
Yes. And then the ritual demanded something incredibly intimate. You didn't just hand the leash to the priest and look away while he did the dirty work. The law required you to place your hands heavily onto the head of the living animal.
The physical contact is key here. It wasn't a passive transaction at all.
Not at all. By pressing your hands onto the animal's head, you were symbolically, legally enacting the imputation. You were making a spiritual declaration. My sin, my guilt, my shattered pane of glass, my unpaid Abel debt is right now being transferred from my ledger to the ledger of this innocent creature.
Wow.
And immediately after that transfer, the animal's throat was cut. Its blood was caught in a basin and splashed against the altar. The innocent died violently in the exact place of the guilty. The sin was imputed to the animal, and in exchange, a temporary covering, a temporary righteousness was imputed back to the man so he wouldn't be struck down by God's justice.
It's a staggering, bloody shadow of what was to come. But here's where it gets really interesting. And honestly, this brings us to the fifth type of imputation, which is the one that completely blew my mind when reviewing Mr. Breaker's notes.
It's a surprising one for sure.
Imputation number 5 is imputation to priests by eating the sacrifice.
It is a bizarre law at first glance, but it is incredibly profound when you actually unpack the typology.
Right? If you read Leviticus 6 and Exodus 29, you find this highly specific law regarding the priests who facilitated the sacrifices. The priests didn't just catch the blood, burn the fat on the fire, and go home. In certain offerings, particularly the sin offering and the peace offering, the priests were commanded by God to actually eat the meat of the sacrificed animal.
They had to consume it.
Yes, and the text suggests that by eating it, a form of righteousness or ceremonial cleanness was imputed to them. But there was a catch, a massive caveat, which Mr. Breaker zeroes in on in Leviticus 7:18 is what we can call the third-day rule.
What's fascinating here is the incredibly precise timing mandated by the law. The text stated that the flesh of the peace offering had to be eaten, but if any of that meat was eaten on the third day, it was suddenly considered an abomination.
Abomination.
The sacrifice would not be accepted by God, and righteousness would absolutely not be imputed to the person who offered it. In fact, the text says their iniquity would remain permanently on them. It had to be completely consumed before that third day arrived.
Okay, my mind immediately races to the New Testament when I hear the phrase third day. I mean, the alarms go off.
As they should. In biblical hermeneutics, this is a massive typological signpost pointing directly across the centuries to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jesus was in the grave for 3 days before he rose. The entire Old Testament sacrificial system is essentially a coded blueprint for the Messiah.
It's all connected.
Exactly. But let's look closer at the eating aspect, because that's where the mechanism of imputation gets really personal. Why did God demand and they eat the meat? Think about the mechanics of eating. When you consume something, it crosses the definitive boundary from being external to you to being internal.
Right? It goes inside you.
It is broken down and literally becomes part of your cellular structure. You are completely internalizing the sacrifice.
And Mr. Breaker used this specific Old Testament mechanism to brilliantly unpack one of the most controversial, confusing things Jesus ever said, which is found in John 6 and Matthew 26. Jesus is teaching a massive crowd, and suddenly he tells his followers that unless they eat his flesh and drink his blood, they have no life in them.
And historically, people have massively misunderstood this. I mean, it caused huge problems.
Right? If you read history, the Roman Empire literally thought early Christians were practicing actual cannibalism in their secret meetings. And even today, as Mr. Breaker clarifies, some major religious traditions believe in the doctrine of transubstantiation,
which is the belief that during communion, the physical wafer and the wine literally biologically transform into the actual flesh and blood of Jesus Christ, even if the outward appearance remains the same.
Exactly. But Mr. Breaker pushes back on that heavily. He argues that Jesus wasn't talking about physical cannibalism, nor was he instituting a mystical, physical transformation of bread. Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, was pointing directly back to this exact Old Testament type of imputation.
Breaker's framework argues that Jesus is the ultimate final sacrifice. He is the Passover lamb. Just as the ancient Levitical priests had to eat the animal sacrifice to have righteousness imputed to their account, Jesus is saying we must eat him.
But not literally.
Right? How do you consume the Son of God who sits in heaven? You don't do it biologically. You do it spiritually. Eating the sacrifice means internalizing his identity, accepting his death totally, and placing your complete, unreserved reliance upon it.
Mr. Breaker brought up Psalms 34:8 to connect these ideas, which says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him." He points out that trusting is the spiritual equivalent of tasting.
And that's a great way to put it.
Believing is how you consume the sacrifice. You don't just look at Jesus hanging on the cross historically and say, "Oh, what a nice, tragic historical event. He was a good teacher."
You have to take that specific sacrifice into yourself by faith. If you don't accept it, if you don't eat it through total desperate trust in what he accomplished, the sacrifice does your ledger absolutely no good. It remains external to you.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Old Testament priest couldn't just stand near the dead animal, watch the smoke go up, and be declared clean. Proximity wasn't enough. He had to ingest it.
He couldn't just be an observer.
Exactly. In the exact same way, the modern sinner cannot just intellectually acknowledge that a man named Jesus existed in the 1st century or that he died a noble death. They must personally appropriate the atonement. It must become the absolute core of their internal spiritual reality. The transfer must be authorized by faith.
That is profound. It moves theology from the head down to the gut, and it perfectly brings us to the climax of this entire study, where all these shadows, all these bloody rituals and accounting metaphors become absolute reality. Yeah.
This covers Imputation 6 and 7, and it is the absolute pinnacle of this structural framework.
This is where it all comes together.
Imputation number 6 is mankind's sin imputed to Jesus Christ.
This is the great pivot point of all human history within this worldview. Everything before it points forward to it, and everything after it points backward to it.
We look at the prophecies in Isaiah 53 and the theological explanation in 2 Corinthians 5:19-21. The text argues that God took the collective weight, the absolute staggering infinite tonnage of every human sin ever committed. We are talking about Adam's original genetic treason. We are talking about your personal hidden sins, my personal sins, the gross atrocities of earthly kings.
Every single one.
Every lie, every murder, every theft. God gathered all of that cosmic debt into one massive sum, and he imputed it to the ledger of Jesus Christ while he hung on the cross. The verse says that God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us.
The psychological and spiritual weight of that is almost incomprehensible. And Mr. Breaker shared a travel anecdote that I think creates an incredibly vivid visual detail for this concept.
The one about Jerusalem.
Yes. He visited Jerusalem and went to an archaeological site near the Temple Mount called Robinson's Arch. If you look below this arch, down in the ancient foundational stones of the street, there are still holes physically drilled deep into the rock by the Romans or the Herodian builders. These holes functioned essentially like handles where heavy ropes were threaded through.
What were they used for?
Historically, this specific area is where the thousands of sacrificial sheep were tied up and kept during Passover. They were tethered to the very architecture of the city. You could walk down that ancient street and see the exact lamb that you were going to purchase. Innocent animal that was going to die for your specific sins at the tabernacle later that day.
Oh, wow. And Breaker uses that imagery to point to Jesus as the ultimate final better lamb. Jesus was essentially tied to the architecture of our fallen world. He was held to the cross not just by Roman nails, but by the unbreakable ropes of God's perfect demanding justice to serve as the final sacrifice.
He was the ultimate fulfillment of that street.
On that cross, he absorbed the infinite wrath that was legally meant for every single one of us. His ledger absorbed the debt of the world,
Which is the terrifying necessary precursor for the seventh and final imputation. You can't have the seventh without the horror of the sixth. The final imputation is Christ's righteousness imputed to the sinner. This is where the cosmic ledger is finally permanently balanced.
This brings us to Romans chapter 4. This is what theologians call the Great Exchange. Christ takes our massive unpayable debt of sin upon himself and pays it in full through death. And in return, when a sinner simply trusts in that specific sacrifice when they eat it by faith, as we discussed, Christ's perfect, sinless, infinite righteousness is imputed, credited directly to their bankrupt account.
It's an incredible transaction.
God the judge looks at the sinner's ledger and he no longer sees the debt of Adam. He no longer sees the personal sins. He sees only the perfect, pristine track record of Jesus Christ. And the framework stresses that it is an entirely free gift. It is completely 100% void of human works.
This raises a really important question, though, about the precise mechanism of this exchange. Why did it have to happen this way? Why did Jesus have to die a bloody death on a Roman cross?
Right? Why not some other way?
Exactly. Mr. Breaker posed a provocative hypothetical to illustrate the strict requirements of this legal system. He asked his audience, what if Jesus was walking near the Sea of Galilee one afternoon, slipped on a wet rock, fell in, and simply drowned?
It sounds almost absurd to even picture that, but it really forces you to think about the mechanics. If he drowned, he still would have died. He was still sinless. He was still the Son of God giving up his life. Would his death by drowning save humanity from their sins?
The answer, according to the strict legal code of the Bible, is no. Death alone was not enough to satisfy the ledger. The biblical currency for the atonement is highly specific.
It goes back to the Old Testament law.
Yes. Romans 3:2-5 and the entire book of Hebrews relentlessly demand the shedding of blood for the remission of sins. The Old Testament principle is that the life of the flesh is in the blood. Therefore, the blood is the specific, non-negotiable currency required to balance the ledger of God's justice.
So Jesus couldn't just die of old age peacefully in his sleep. He couldn't die of a disease or drowning or being suffocated.
Exactly. The blood had to be violently, visibly poured out as a payment. It is a gruesome but necessary requirement of the justice system established in Leviticus. And we must receive that specific blood atonement by faith, as Paul says in Romans 5:11. We due in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom we have now received the atonement. It's not just believing in God in some vague sense. It's believing in the specific mechanism of a bloody cross.
Okay. So let's say I track with all of this. I acknowledge my debt. I place my faith in that specific bloody sacrifice, and I eat the sacrifice spiritually. Christ's infinite righteousness is imputed to my account. My ledger says perfect.
You're clear.
A massive M. Massive question immediately arises, and it's one people fight about constantly. Can I lose it? If I have this perfect righteousness imputed to me today, but I go out and do something terrible tomorrow, does God look at the ledger, take his eraser, delete Christ's righteousness, and put my debt back on the books?
This dives right into the doctrine of eternal security, and it's a vital component of Mr. Breaker's teaching. He turns to Ephesians 1:13 to answer this anxiety. The verse outlines a sequence. It says that after you heard the word of truth, the gospel, and after you believed, you were sealed with that Holy Spirit of promise.
Sealed. I'm going to focus on that word. Like a royal wax seal on an ancient legal document that proves its authenticity and guarantees it cannot be broken by anyone except the king.
Exactly. The transaction is finalized. When you trust the gospel, the Holy Spirit acts as the seal on your ledger. The imputation is locked in permanently. You are secure forever because the righteousness on your account isn't yours. It's Christ's, and Christ cannot sin. But people push back on that, right?
Oh, there is always severe pushback from critics who claim that teaching eternal security is dangerous.
Right? The argument is that it gives people a license to sin. People say, oh, my ledger is clean forever, no matter what. Great. I can just do whatever I want. I can live like the devil because I have a get out of hell free card.
And Mr. Breaker addressed that exact criticism directly. He quoted another preacher who foolishly boasted, "Because I'm saved, I can do whatever the hell I want."
Which just sounds so arrogant and completely misses the point, completely misses the heart of the transaction. Breaker's response, and the broader biblical response, is nuanced. Technically, yes, you still possess free will in your physical body to make terrible, destructive choices, but a true believer is saved to serve, not saved to sin. The nature of the transaction, having the Holy Spirit enter you, fundamentally changes your desires and your heart.
Because if you truly, deeply comprehend the staggering agony Christ just went through to pay your unpayable debt, your psychological response shouldn't be to run out and eagerly rack up more debt just because you theoretically can. It should produce immense gratitude.
Furthermore, the framework makes it clear that while you will never lose your eternal salvation, your ledger remains balanced. Earthly chastisement from a loving Father absolutely still applies.
Like discipline.
Yes. If a child disobeys, a good father disciplines them. God will discipline his children in this life to correct their path. There can be severe earthly consequences for sin, and the text talks about a loss of heavenly rewards at the judgment seat. But the fundamental ledger of salvation, the question of heaven or hell, that remains perfectly, permanently balanced by the imputed righteousness of Christ.
That security is breathtaking. It means you can actually finally rest. You aren't waking up every morning frantically trying to do enough good deeds to keep your account out of the red, terrified that one slip up will send you to hell. It's a completed work.
It's resting in what's already done.
And that reality leads us to our final major section, which looks at the scope of this framework. Because if this specific legal mechanism is the only way the ledger is balanced, it has massive, urgent implications for every single human being on the planet, regardless of their cultural background.
This brings us to a really compelling, highly sensitive Q&A segment from Mr. Breaker's study involving a Cherokee man named Bill.
Yes, I wanted to spend some time here because this is so relevant today. Bill was sharing with Mr. Breaker the deep, painful struggles he has trying to share this gospel message with his own indigenous community. He explained that many of his people fiercely reject Christianity, viewing it entirely as a white man's religion.
Which is a very common objection.
It is the argument in the community goes like this. We already had a deep relationship with the Creator. We knew God existed. We respected the earth long before European colonizers arrived on boats with the Bible. We don't need this imported foreign religion, forced upon us. Why would our ancestors be condemned if they already knew the Creator?
This is an incredibly heavy issue. It carries the weight of centuries of colonialism, cultural erasure, and historical trauma. But Mr. Breaker navigates it firmly by returning to the objective framework of the 7 imputations.
Right? He goes back to the structure.
What's fascinating here is how he uses the theology of Romans chapter 1 to address Bill's community. Romans 1 clearly states the concept of general revelation. It argues that God reveals his existence and his invisible attributes through the observable natural world.
Right? Everyone everywhere, regardless of whether they have a Bible, can look at the complexity of a sunset, the majesty of a mountain, or the intricate biology of a leaf and know inherently that a creator, an intelligent designer exists. The indigenous cultures absolutely possessed this knowledge, often much more deeply than industrialized cultures.
And furthermore, as we discussed with the second imputation, every culture inherently, they possesses a conscience. They know right from wrong. They have internal laws against murder, against theft, against betrayal.
It's universal.
So the framework agrees with Bill's community. All people in all cultures across all of time are aware of a creator. And they are also universally aware of their own moral failings against their own internal conscience.
But, and this is the painful but necessary theological truth that Breaker asserts, acknowledging a creator is not the same thing as having your ledger cleared. Knowing God exists doesn't balance the debt.
Exactly. Merely believing in the existence of a creator doesn't reverse the imputation of Adam's sin, nor does it provide a legal payment for your personal sins against your conscience. Knowing there is a judge doesn't pay your fine.
That's a hard truth.
The gospel, according to this framework, is not a cultural export. As Mr. Breaker gently pointed out to Bill, the Bible isn't a European document, it's Middle Eastern. Jesus was Jewish, living under Roman occupation. The faith was born in the margins, but beyond its geographical and historical origins. The gospel claims to be the singular universal cure for a universal human condition.
Every human being has the exact same genetic disease from Adam. It does not matter what your heritage is, what continent you were born on, who your ancestors were, or how deep and beautiful your cultural pride runs. Every individual needs the imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ, because every individual has a ledger full of moral debt. Every person has broken the law of their own God-given conscience.
It's the great leveler. Breaker's point is that accepting the gospel isn't about abandoning your culture or assimilating into European norms. It's about solving the universal mathematical problem of sin that transcends all cultures.
That is the ultimate takeaway of this entire framework. The cross is the great equalizer of humanity. It violently levels all human pride, whether that is white pride, indigenous pride, intellectual pride, or religious pride. It declares that everyone is equally bankrupt, and it offers the exact same perfect imputation of righteousness to anyone who will simply believe. The ground is completely level at the foot of the cross.
What an incredible, dense journey through the text. To quickly recap the structure we've explored, God perfectly organized this doctrine of imputation in 7 logical historical steps. 1. Adam's original sin is imputed to us, giving us a fallen genetic nature.
Which is the foundation of the problem.
Right? 2. Our personal sin is imputed to our individual ledger when we reach the age of accountability and violate our conscience. 3. Earthly kings and laws impute guilt to us when we break societal rules, showing the flaw of human justice. 4. In the Old Testament, righteousness was temporarily imputed through the bloody substitution of animal sacrifice.
Setting the stage for the final solution.
Exactly. 5. Levitical priests received imputation by internalizing or eating that sacrifice before the 3rd day. 6. The climax of all history, all mankind's sin, was imputed to the ultimate Lamb, Jesus Christ, on the cross. And 7. The beautiful permanent conclusion. Christ's perfect righteousness is imputed freely to any sinner who receives it by faith.
It is a mathematically flawless system of justice and mercy. And as we conclude this video podcast, I want to offer a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over on your own time. Consider the accounting ledger of your own soul. Imagine it sitting open on a desk in front of you right now.
A full audit.
If every single thought you've ever had, every hidden action behind closed doors, every selfish motive, every lie, every compromise were audited today by a perfectly holy, omniscient judger, what would your balance be? Would you really be willing to rely on your own spiritual bankruptcy? Would you try to present your handful of good deeds as payment for a mountain of debt? Or are you resting entirely on the infinite credited wealth of Christ's perfect record? Because according to this framework, the ledger must be balanced. The only question that matters is whose righteousness is written on your page.
In closing, we must always remember that because we are all fallen children of Adam, we cannot rely on our own religious fig leaves to save us. We must rely entirely on the gospel of grace that was given to the Apostle Paul. In 1 Corinthians 15 to 1 to 4, Paul declares the only gospel that saves today. How that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day. This is the preaching of the cross, which is the very power of God into salvation to everyone that believes. It takes more of God's power to save a sinner than it did to create the entire universe. We are saved not by our works, but simply by placing our faith in this beautiful finished work of the cross. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. And thank you for watching.